Welcome to Data Skeptic All About Surveys, our season about survey design, interpretation, and methodology. Let your voice be heard at survey.dataskeptic.com. Welcome to the second episode of Data Skeptic All About Surveys. I have a great interview lined up for you today. It involves a reproducible analysis, which is something I always like to see. The research looks into how Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, as well as Prolific, which is another survey panelist platform, how responses from those two sources compare to a Pew Research survey, where the Pew team went to great lengths to measure from the general public. Now there's a hope that there's a match there, in which case you can rely on those sources, Mechanical Turk and Prolific. You could go there to get respondents for your survey, and those respondents would, in theory, well represent the general population, or Gen Pop as it's often called. Does that turn out to be true? Hang tight for the interview in just a minute or two. I myself had a third option. It can be very difficult to get people to take your survey. I didn't go to MTurk or Prolific. I asked you, the listeners, last week to take my survey. And as the recording of this intro, we've had well over 100 responses, so thank you all very much. Please, if you haven't yet, head over to survey.dataskeptic.com and let your voice be heard. But of the responses we already have, hopefully, those responses are representative of all listeners. I don't know if you guys represent Gen Pop. In fact, I know you don't from looking at the results, which I'm going to go through with you guys right now. Highest level of education turns out to be master's degree. Bachelor's in a close second with doctoral degree in third place. Not the order I was expecting, but those are the top three I was expecting. What is your professional title? Lots of data scientists? Oh, and if you go look at the results, which you can do after you take the survey, I'll let you see these same things. Regarding professional title, we show the recent 10 responses. That's just what I came up with when I was coding this. I'm looking for other ideas about creative ways I might display this data. A short open text field. But please do not suggest a word cloud. Anyway, shout out to the mortgage processor, pharmacist, and agricultural engineer. Those were three I did not expect in the list. Mobile operating system, Android first place, iOS second, Windows at a close third. What are you two other people using? Now here's a good question. How often do you use an ad blocker? I wish I had measured this before our ad tech season to see if the audience raised their level of participation. But as it stands, always most popular answer, 47% of you, almost half, are always using an ad blocker. 21% never using one. How many books did you read last year? Well, if you go look at the responses, I'm not happy with the way I built this part of the thing. I'm going to rebuild this on the focus group, if you want to come watch me do that live. Right now, we're just reporting the mean, the min, and the max. So the mean average, arithmetic mean of how many books you guys said you read last year, 12.4. Almost one a month. Our minimum being 0, no surprise. And our maximum 125. Who read it? Wow, somebody read 125 books. Years at your current residence, mean value 6.2, min and max 0 and 45. Now here's kind of a design flaw I made. I didn't make it very clear that you could go on and take a bunch of other surveys. If you already took our onboarding survey, head back to survey.dataskeptic.com. On the same machine, it'll remember you as long as you don't clear your cookies. That'll allow you to see the results yourself to anything you've taken, and also participate in one of our other surveys there, including our board game survey, media consumption, or these silly questions. Let's check that out. In the silly survey, I asked people, what is the best name for a crow? A very close tie between Edgar and Cheryl. Who would make the best co-host for Data Skeptic? Options being Wanda Sykes, Professor X, Bill Clinton, Hulk Hogan, Chuck Nice, and Greta Thunberg. Professor X remains with a strong lead. I asked which superpower listeners would prefer from a list of 10. Invisibility, the far dominating popular choice. That's just a quick sampling of some of the results you can see yourself if you participate in these surveys. I'm going to launch something new every Friday at least throughout this season. So check back weekly. These are going to get more serious as I learn from our guests the proper way to do methodological things. I just read an excellent book on this topic, and we're going to be talking to the author pretty soon. So between now and then, I'll shape up the quality of my surveys, hopefully. And if you share your opinions, that's going to help me shape the show. So last plug, survey.dataskeptic.com. Now on to the interview.
I'm Jenny Tang. I am a societal computing PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, and I am also affiliated with SciLab, which is the CMU Security and Privacy Institute.
Very neat. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're studying in your PhD?
Yeah, so societal computing is an interesting combination of both computer science and I suppose social sciences, looking at the social technical views of security and privacy, at least for me. So my background is in both political science and computer science. So I double majored at Wellesley College. And so my interests are at the intersection of these two fields. So I want to do interdisciplinary work that bridges these two disciplines. For example, looking at how we can, bridge the gaps and the communication gaps between policymakers and technologists, as well as thinking about, the different constructions of security from political science and computer science and where those overlap and how we might work in that overlap.
So security seems to be a layered problem, right? There's security down at the TCP/IP stack and encryption, and then there's all the ways we interact with it and how we make sure people's privacy is preserved. I guess where within the big umbrella are most of your interests?
I think currently, if we want to use computer science terms, I
Mhm.
work in usable security and privacy. So, security and privacy where there are humans, because again, you can have the most secure encryption, you can have, perfect security, and then someone's like, oh, here's my password. That's going to not be great,
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of that, it's usable security and privacy. In terms of actually my political science interests, my background is in security studies, so international security, national security. So, I like to call what I do a combination of security as political science and security as computer science. So, I call it cyber, even though that's a very vague and not well defined field.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does the use of survey as a measurement or instrument tool come into your realm?
So, for usable security and privacy, a lot of times we use a lot of surveys to try and figure out what the general public thinks because, when you're a computer scientist and you're surrounded by people who study security all the time, you don't really necessarily get the most accurate view of what the general public thinks because you're like, of course, everyone changes their password for everything or use a password manager, or of course, we have two-factor authentication, YubiKeys, and all of these things. And then you're like, oh, wait, no, actually, the people we're trying to help and to build systems for aren't like that. And so for surveys, this is why generalizability and talking about how well did these surveys actually map to the populations we want to talk about matter. So again, it's you don't talk to, the people sitting near you because our experiences are not universal, it turns out.
Absolutely. And you said populations, plural, which I agree with. There are lots of ways we could divide up a population, and even someone listening to this podcast, we can take for granted they have access to the right technology to get podcasts. They're probably a little bit technical to be interested in this program. They're exceptional in that regard. That's not a typical person. Do you have a way of slicing up the population or what the key dimensions you look at are?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about surveys, we both think about our target population as well as our sample population, right? So sometimes your target population is, well, I want to talk about a user in the United States. So technically, your target population is anyone in the United States,
Hmm.
but your sample population often isn't, right? When we conduct these online surveys, our sample population is, well, people who are on these platforms who are willing to take surveys and who are going to answer. Whereas, sometimes your target population is going to be, well, I want to specifically look at developers, people who work in this field, because I want to talk about tools that can make development easier or more secure. In that case, your target population is going to be different. So I suppose population really depends on what kind of questions you're asking and what kind of research you're doing.
So when you've decided you want to conduct a survey, what solutions are available for you to get in touch with that random sampling or hopefully random sampling of people that are out there?
Yeah, so I can speak more specifically to the usable security and privacy field because
Mhm.
that's where I'm in. And so we often use one of two online platforms, MTurk, so Amazon Mechanical Turk, MTurk, which we call it, is one that's quite popular. And nowadays, actually, we see a lot of academics moving to a platform called Prolific, which was meant specifically to be a survey platform. This is part of the focus of this paper, actually, where we're looking at how well these platforms generalize the US population. And these are all, online. And I know some people have also used Qualtrics panels, I believe. And some people I've also seen use, recruiting platforms like Reddit or Craigslist, or just putting posters online. So there are a lot of different possible ways, and they all have their benefits and drawbacks.
For listeners who don't really know this world, are there any assumptions that they should, or common wisdom that we can bring to the table right away? For example, I mean, we know anyone who's going to take an online survey, you're missing the people who won't take online surveys. Are there known representation issues out there like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, one thing we found with online platforms is that they tend to skew very young. For our prolific sample, about 80%, 88% of our population was under 50 years old for one of our prolific samples. The same for MTurk, which is not true for the general population, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also, these platforms tend to have people who are more highly educated than the general population. So you're going to see more people with at least some college education and very few users with a high school diploma or less, which is again not true of the general population. Another thing, actually, this is pretty funny for prolific specifically, is that the gender ratio on prolific skews female very heavily. And this was because actually there was a viral TikTok sometime last year where someone I think went, oh, yeah, like you can make a lot of money just doing surveys on prolific. And so their user base or their follower base tended to be younger women. And so I believe at this time, Prolific has about twice as many women as men on the platform.
How interesting, yeah. It almost sounds unbelievable. First, 99% of stocks lost value in a single day. Now we're riding out the S&P 500's longest losing streak since the Great Recession. The only thing that seems to be impervious to inflation is Costco hot dogs. But let's get real, and I'll tell you about a platform that delivers exceptional returns, even during this year's record-setting losses. It's called Masterworks. Business Insider called them the go-to when it comes to art investing. In the Financial Times, they said Masterworks is the investment platform to watch. But let's talk actual results, because Masterworks just sold another painting in early November. That brings their last 3 sales to 17%, 21%, and 33% net returns, right to their investors. That's right, over 17% net returns even in 2022. When we first started talking about Masterworks, they had maybe a few thousand investors. Now there's over 560,000 members and $500 million invested. In fact, they've come a long way in a short time. They have a wait list to sign up right now. But you can skip it by using the promo code DataSkeptic at Masterworks.com. That's code DataSkeptic to skip the wait list at Masterworks.com. See important Regulation A disclosures at Masterworks.com/CD. And then in terms of trying to compare it, it would be nice if we could have some ground truth to measure against, but I don't know that you have direct access to ground truth. What's the closest we can come to compare these survey respondents against?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, obviously, if we want a true ground truth, we'd run a census and we hope that everyone answers truthfully, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically not possible for most people. So, what we did in our paper actually is we looked at a probabilistic sample conducted by the Pew Research Center, since they have the resources and I think they have the people to do that. And so basically, a probabilistic sample, at least the one we looked at from Pew, is one where they had responses from 4,272 people across the United States. They balanced it on a lot of demographic factors such as age, location, gender, etc. And they tried to make sure that after some probabilistic weighting, it was as close to the true demographics of the US population as possible. And so this is a large scale survey that they sent to populations that we might not be able to reach, because for their samples, they recruit over a few years and they have access to people who don't really use internet, who don't use these platforms. And so these are populations that if you're, deploying it online, you're not going to be able to reach as easily.
If I had been a respondent in the survey, what sorts of questions would I have had to answer?
We very specifically looked at security and privacy questions. We asked 5 different types of questions, which we found tended to show up in useful security and privacy surveys. So the first type is behavioral questions. what do you do in terms of like your online behavior? In particular, we asked about social media use. So, do you use Twitter? Do you use Facebook? We also asked about experiences, so negative security experiences in this case, which is, has this happened to you? Have you had your account taken over by someone in the last 12 months without your permission? The third type of question we asked was knowledge questions. So, these are questions with factually correct answers. And so we had one correct answer, 3 to 5 incorrect answers, as well as a not sure option. And so these questions would be like, when a website has a privacy policy, what does that mean? We also had perception questions. That was our fourth category, which is about attitudes such as trust, comfort levels, and mental models. And our final category was about beliefs. So this is a norms based question about what should or ought to be true. So, for example, should people have the right to have information about their work history removed from the internet? And so these questions were taken directly from the Pew survey and asked in the exact same way in our survey. So we had a direct matching to our ground truth or gold standard. And also because when we read through the papers published in the past year in usable security and privacy that used surveys, most of the questions fell into one of these 5 categories.
And can we dig into some of the results comparing these two? You've got your Mechanical Turk population and the prolific respondents, and now sort of your baseline at Pew. How do the three groups, or can you tell them apart? I guess is the key question.
Yeah, so we had 4 different samples, or we collected 3 samples, and then we had the Pew sample, which we used to compare to as a proxy for the US population. We had an MTurk sample, a prolific gender balance sample, as well as a prolific representative sample. Each of the 3 samples we collected had 800 people. And the prolific samples, the reason we distinguish that is, as I mentioned before, prolific has this quality of having way more women than men on the platform. So they offer this service, which lets you select a gender balance sample, which gives you 50% men and 50% women, which, kind of mitigates this. So that's our gender balance sample. And then our representative sample is prolific allows you to get a sample that is kind of balanced to the US or the UK population in terms of ethnicity, age, and gender, I believe. So, in that sense, we selected the US representative sample, which hopefully was pretty close to the US population. And what we found here is actually that the MTurk sample tended to be not as representative of the US population as denoted by the Pew data as the gender balance sample or the representative sample from Prolific, and that the Prolific representative sample tended to do the best, and the gender balance sample performed nearly as well, though not quite as well.
Do you have any? I know you can't necessarily know the true root cause, but do you have any hypotheses as to why MTurk would be the outlier, so to speak?
Actually, this is a interesting question. This was actually what spurred the writing of this paper, actually, because MTurk was very popular. I used to use MTurk for my surveys as well. And this is actually a replication of an older paper by Alyssa Redmile, Strongcross, and Michelle Mazurek, which looked at the generalizability of MTurk. And back then, when they ran their studies in 2017, they found that MTurk tended to be pretty generalizable for populations under 50 or with some college education for questions about experiences, advice sources on security and privacy, as well as feelings of knowledge, but not behaviors. In the 5 years since then, and this was, I had anecdotal evidence of that, was that a lot of people were just answering questions kind of strangely. And so a lot of people seem to be not real humans answering these questions. A lot of them seem to be bots.
Uh-huh.
And so data quality might have gone down for that reason. And so that was part of what spurred the paper, which was, hey, anecdotally, it seems that our data is not as good as it used to be. And so what can we do? Why is it like this? Is this true?
Well, I know 2 anecdotes do not consist of a data set, but
Yeah.
I have an anecdote also of being a little bit frustrated with some attempts to use Mechanical Turk and getting, I'll just say, certainly disingenuous responses from them.
Yeah.
But, I didn't take it further. I just kind of was frustrated and walked away. I had thought about implementing some techniques to try and ferret out if they're real people or not. Had you considered anything like that?
Yeah, so in our paper, we looked at a few generally used techniques that, well, attention checks, right? And so there are 3 main types of attention checks that you see. The first would be what are also known as instruction manipulation checks. These are questions that are basically like, select this specific answer, instructing respondents to behave in a specific way. And so those are just like, oh, if you're a human and reading this, please select strongly disagree or something like that, telling people to select a specific answer. There are CAPTCHAs, of course. So we've all seen those, which are like, please click on all boxes that contain the traffic light or something like that. And then the third type we used were text box attention checks. So these are questions which ask you to type in an answer, and these are the ones that I found most success with. So in this case, we asked people to define data privacy in their own words.
And when you look at the responses, what kind of range do you see?
Oh, I just realized we asked people to define digital privacy in their own words. Anyway,
Aha.
and so when we looked at the range of responses, we found that everyone who saw a CAPTCHA passed the CAPTCHA. So it turns out CAPTCHAs, at least in this sense, are not very good at filtering out bots on these platforms if they exist. As for our multiple choice attention check questions, so click this specific answer, we found that more people on Prolific, both samples failed, than on MTurk. However, the opposite was true for our text box attention check questions. So for the question asking people what digital privacy means in their own words, we found that over 39% of our respondents on MTurk failed, whereas less than 1% in either of our Prolific samples failed. And what we mean by failed is when we ask people to find things in their own words, right? If you just type in digital privacy, that doesn't really mean defining digital privacy in your own words. The other thing was we saw some really great answers for digital privacy. I read them and I was like, wow, this is a really good answer. I don't know if I could, answer as well. And then by the like fifth or sixth time you read the exact same answer, you go like, oh, something is wrong here. This is not in your own words. And you look at it and you go, oh, they searched up digital privacy on a search engine and they copy pasted the first thing that came up, or like the definition from Wikipedia or something like that. And you go, oh, that might not be a real human because that's not in their own words. So what we meant by failing is if a response was repeated verbatim 5 or more times, that was a failed attention check because that was not in their own words. And again, this only happened for MTurk and not for either of our Prolific samples.
Well, that's especially troubling because had you not caught it, not only is it one person being disingenuous, it sounds like they were in there 5 times, really weighing down your data set.
Yeah, it might not have been the same one person. It could have been a bot script that goes,
Hmm.
oh, if you're asking to define something, go to the internet, copy, something that sounds similar. Because we've seen similar things in other studies before as well, where if you have a text box, you will get something that is actually seems fairly reasonable. But when you look at it, you go, wow, a lot of people are answering the exact same way. That doesn't seem right.
Well, with these sorts of checks in place, can you filter enough that MTurk starts to look like clean water?
Yeah, actually. So when we removed all of the text box attention check questions that failed, or all the users that failed the text box attention check questions, so what we did is we have this best case scenario for all of our samples, which was we looked at users who were under 50, which were found to be representative by prior work, or people with some college education, which was also found to be representative in or generalizable in prior work. And we finally removed anyone who failed an attention check, whether that be the text box attention check, the reading attention check, or the CAPTCHA. No one failed our CAPTCHAs. And finally, we applied weighting. So we knew our demographics were not exactly similar to the US population. So we weighted it so that they were similar in terms of age, race. Yeah, we weighted them so they were similar in terms of age, race, education, and gender. When we did that, we had a best case scenario, which is you take all of the possible things you could do to make your data as generalizable as possible. And in that case, the MTurk sample was similar to our raw prolific samples.
Does that then make it, I guess, a worthwhile source that you can still get what you need out of it, but you have a lot of cleaning steps? Or do all of these hurdles make it a less desirable place to do research?
I think it depends on what you want to do and what kinds of questions you're asking. So, for example, right, if the raw prolific data doesn't need a lot of filtering, that takes less time. It's also slightly less costly, right? Because you have to make a decision. Are you going to pay the workers that you think are bots? What if they're just real people and just really bad at reading, right? Or the other thing is the amount of completed tasks that a person on MTurk completes affects their scores and how and the future tasks that they're able to get. So if you do that, if you either accept or reject these responses that you don't think are valid, that really affects the kinds of tasks that this worker will be able to get in the future. So that's a decision you have to make. The other thing is, I definitely would suggest that if you believe there are bots, to use text box attention checks over other types of attention checks, because that seems to be the best way to filter out incorrect or non human responses. But in that sense, weighting is the other thing we did. And obviously, for probabilistic samples, you have to weight them to be as close to the US population as you can. We weighted on 4 different characteristics. So that, once again, is age, gender, education, and race. But the thing is, maybe we could have weighted on other things. Maybe we could have weighted on technical background. So the things that you generalize to also affect, I suppose, how your data comes out, because maybe age isn't as important for the questions we're asking. Maybe it's whether or not you work in a technical field that affects how you answer these questions. And maybe these are related. I think researchers have to make a decision about what they are choosing to weight on. If they do that, they have to make a decision on what kind of data they accept if they are looking at attention checks.
Well, I'm going to ask a question now inspired right from the title of the paper. How well do your results generalize now?
Yeah, and I think this is a question of how closely you want your results to match, the general population as represented by you. On a high level, I think the prolific samples, the prolific representative sample and the prolific gender balance sample tend to generalize pretty well to the US population in terms of experiences, perceptions, and beliefs, but not at all well for behavior, especially social media use or for knowledge. MTurk tends to be the MTurk best case scenario that I spoke about earlier, tends to generalize okay, and it is much, much better than the raw MTurk data. It depends on both the sample and the types of questions you're asking. I would say that for experiences, perceptions, and beliefs, you can say that these are fairly generalizable. For social media use behavior, it tends to be that those on online platforms tend to use social media much more, or rather, like, say that yes, they use these platforms. And for knowledge, people on Prolific tend to answer the questions correct more often. So both for MTurk and Prolific, people tend to say not sure much less often, but people on Prolific tend to get the answers right more often, whereas people on our raw MTurk sample tend to get the answers wrong more often. And that could also just be because if you're a bot and you're randomly clicking, it's more likely you're going to click on a wrong answer.
Well, the paper shares a good list of best practices and recommendations for other people conducting similar work. Would you highlight maybe a few of the key ones that you think resonate the best?
Yeah, I think for this one, it's a lot of questions are about attention checks because we want our data to be as good as possible. And generally speaking, at least at the time of when we were writing this paper, we would not necessarily recommend attention checks for Prolific simply because it makes surveys longer without really being necessary to filter out data. Whereas if you're using platforms such as MTurk, where you suspect there might be bots where it's not real humans answering, we suggest using text box attention checks over multiple choice, so reading attention checks. A lot of people who fail the text box attention check manage to pass our reading attention checks. And overall, CAPTCHAs don't tend to be that useful, at least in our experience. In other senses, I think maybe prefer Prolific to MTurk while recruiting for security and privacy surveys, because we did find that our data quality was better on Prolific, as well as I think overall be cognizant of the types of questions you're asking and the types of conclusions you're drawing from these questions. The types of questions you ask might be similar. For example, maybe people have similar attitudes, whether they're on these online platforms or they're just part of the general public, but their behaviors might differ or their knowledge base might differ. For example, people on these platforms might be more tech savvy, So questions about technical things might not be as generalizable to the general population as you would want it to be.
Well, I'd like to dig into some of the results too, if you wouldn't mind. Maybe broadly speaking, what are some of the worst behaviors people admit to?
We didn't actually ask about that because for behaviors, so what happened was we were limited by our Pew study.
Sure.
The behavioral questions in the Pew study were about whether or not people use certain types of social media. And so in that case, we couldn't actually ask
Gotcha.
about
Yeah, yeah.
worst behaviors, unfortunately. We did ask whether or not people decided not to use a product or service because they were worried about how much personal information would be collected about them. I believe most people said no, they haven't done that, but I would need to check on that.
Did you see anything different from the Pew results that maybe you would attribute to time? Hopefully, people are monotonically increasing in their awareness and wisdom about privacy and security.
Sorry, going back to the last question, I just checked whether or not it's actually half and half, whether or not people said they decided not to use services or products because they were worried about the data that would be collected about them, which is kind of heartening. I would have expected more people to say no, they haven't. But yes, changes over time from the Pew data. So the Pew data was collected in, I believe, 2019, June 2019, and we collected our data in early 2020. So it's been 2 or 3 years since then. So the difference in higher usage of social media, we at first suspected, oh, this might have been because a pandemic happened and everyone was stuck indoors. So maybe the higher use of social media was because everyone was online. But we actually found that was not likely to be the case because Pew actually conducts these American Trends panels every so often, I believe every few weeks or months. So we looked at one and they released their data 2 years after the collection. What we found actually was, I believe, in 2021, the rate of social media use for these platforms from another probabilistic Pew sample hadn't changed that much. So in that case, the difference between our samples and the Pew sample is not likely to be attributed to time. And I believe, I'm not entirely sure if Pew asks the same questions over time for their trends panels. If so, that would be a very interesting longitudinal study looking at changes over time. The one thing I will note is that they don't ask the exact same few panel participants. So you can't really necessarily do a one-to-one mapping because it could be different people being asked the same questions.
And will survey play a big component in your current and future research?
I believe so. For some of it, yes. For some of it, no. I am currently a first year PhD student, so I'm still kind of finding my way. I definitely think that if I'm doing usable security and privacy, I will have to ask, the general public and other people what they think. This is true for people who are in any field. You make assumptions about the knowledge base and the behaviors of other people because you're surrounded by people who do this stuff all day. And so it's really important to get out of that and go, oh, hey, I didn't know that people did this, or I didn't know that, actually in general people thought this. It's really important to, I suppose, not make assumptions just based on things you know about security and privacy behaviors and try and understand that, oh, yeah, nope, my experiences are not universal. And that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. If I mean, digital is taking over more parts of our life, everything's coming online. Hopefully, people's attitudes and behaviors and understanding of privacy and security is increasing, maybe faster. But if you had to give our society a report card grade, how well are we doing?
Oh dear, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that because I forgot who made this comment about the pandemic was that, our physical world shrank quite a lot over the pandemic. So our digital world expanded, which necessitated putting more and more of ourselves online. And in that case, I can't really blame people for not taking security precautions or for putting themselves online and sometimes to their detriment because it happens because the more information there is online about you, the more likely it is that something might happen to it. There's also the problem of, weighting convenience as against your privacy and security. I suppose in research, there's something we call the privacy paradox, which is people go, no, 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 I care so much about my privacy and security. I would never give out this information. And that turns out, they'll give you their, I wouldn't say social security number. They'll give you some information for like a Snickers bar, right? You'll set up a table with some candy and go like, oh, please fill out this form. People will just be like, yep, here's my social security number. Please don't give your social security number out. So things like that. And so some of it might not even be conscious for users when they take these actions. I couldn't really give a report card grade. I hope we all pass.
Fair enough. Let's hope for that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jenny, what's next for you in your work?
I have a few projects ongoing, so I'll talk about just a few of them. One of them that's related to this is I'm currently looking at misinformation, miscitations in academia. So what I mean by this is a lot of times we read papers, we read their abstracts, we go like, oh, this paper said this, and I can use this as prior work or to justify some of the methods I'm doing. And sometimes people don't necessarily use all of the nuances that are in these papers. In this paper, right, I say that prolific tends to generalize quite well for certain types of questions. That doesn't mean prolific generalizes well for all security and privacy questions. And that doesn't mean prolific generalizes well for, surveys outside usable security and privacy. I put these nuances in my paper, but I have like 12 pages to talk about that. If you're citing another paper as work to justify your methodology or for prior work, you have maybe a few sentences, a paragraph to do that, if that. So a lot of times people miss nuances. I think that researchers are quite good at talking about the limitations of their data and their samples, etc., in their own papers. I think researchers are quite cognizant about that. The nuance is often lost when other people talk about it. So there's downstream effects of, what if people look at this paper and just go like, prolific is generalizable, the end.
Right.
Whereas what I'm saying is prolific is generalizable for usable security and privacy questions about, experiences, perceptions, and beliefs. So in that case, it's looking at, so one of my projects currently is looking at, how academic misinformation, I want to say, kind of spreads, the loss of nuance in these cases. And another thing I'm currently working on is actually, again, my background is computer science and political science. I work on bridging the gaps between policy and technical communities. So I'm actually working with the Federation of American Scientists Day One project on a racial equity and technology policy accelerator. So at the end of the accelerator, we will have a policy proposal to increase racial equity in technology, because we see actually online when you miss certain populations. So for example, in surveys, if you think of like the average user or you think about generalizability, you might miss that older people are not represented in your answer. You might miss that, people of certain races are not represented in your sample. And if you go forward with your research and solutions based on that, you might find you're not actually taking into account everyone. And so back to the policy accelerator, we're looking at how to address racially motivated or gender-based harassment online, how to hold platforms accountable for things like that, and in a way that, can bring together my technical and policy backgrounds.
Very exciting work. I look forward to following up on that too.
Mm-hmm, thank you.
And is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
I do have a Twitter. The handle is whatiscyber. I am not super active on there, but I will tweet about things I've done occasionally.
Sounds good. We'll have a link in the show notes for listeners who want to follow up. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Well, that's it for this installment of Data Skeptic All About Surveys. If you are listening as this drops in 2023 and you are available Wednesday, January 18th at 3 p.m. Pacific Time, please join me for the first ever Data Skeptic The Focus Group. This is our live stream we're going to run for the All About Surveys season. In addition to the feedback you can share at survey.dataskeptic.com, this is intended to be, like a focus group, a more direct way to interact if you're so inclined. If nobody shows up, I'm just going to code and do work on our survey platform. If that interests you, you can come check it out. But I am going to have some special guests from time to time. And most of all, I want to take questions from the audience. Go to dataskeptic.com/live, Live. Whether you're going to make it to the first one or one in the future, dataskeptic.com/live will always have the up-to-date information on when the next installment of The Focus Group will take place. One last time, survey.dataskeptic.com. And if you'd like to chat live, please join me for the focus group this Wednesday or otherwise at dataskeptic.com/live.